How could you not like them?
Because Blink-182 is a punk failure. They suck on each other's dicks and think they are cool.
Pop punk is an interesting corner of the rock and metal universe. On the one hand, it's some of the most popular alternative music ever made, with artists like Green Day, Avril Lavigne, and Blink-182 achieving certified legendary status to the point where even the most normie of normies knows their songs. And bands like Sum 41, Newfound Glory, and Simple Plan aren't far behind that, with millions and millions of albums sold. So obviously tons of people love pop punk, but at the same time, pop punk is also one of the most consistently hated genres, with critics saying things like, quote, "Its shelf life is remarkably poor, and it brings absolutely nothing of consequence to the table," as IGN put it, and many elitist fans kind of looking down their nose at pop punk as some sort of like musical abomination for children. And my question is, why? What exactly is so bad about pop punk that it's gotten so much hate from both critics and fans for the last 30 years on kind of one side of the musical world, and yet at the same time also selling millions of albums? How can both of those things be true at once? Those are the questions I will answer in this video. And also, I want to thank Opera for sponsoring this video. It's a faster, safer, smarter web browser optimized for privacy, security, and everything you do online. And it's got a ton of really cool, innovative features. For example, a music player in the sidebar that supports Spotify, Apple Music, Deezer, Tidal, and more. So it's just right there and you can control it without leaving the browser and easily switch between them. It also has a built-in AI chat where you can ask it anything, again, right in the browser, and a really helpful AI compose feature that will help you write emails, social posts, or whatever else. And you can even train it to write in your personal style. And also, as somebody that watches a lot of YouTube in the background while I'm doing other things, I also really like the video pop-out feature where you can detach videos each into their own little floating window. Very handy. There's also tab islands, which is very cool and very useful for anybody like me who tends to have just an absolutely obscene amount of tabs open and definitely needs a little bit of help in keeping them organized. So if you want to check it out, just hit the link in the description of this video. And to understand this, we need to go back to the very beginning. The entire concept of pop punk itself, I think, is interesting because it kind of implies that punk itself is inherently not pop, which I think is kind of debatable. Now, of course, that is true to some extent because a big part of the genesis of punk was kind of a deliberate reaction to the mainstream music of the 70s that had gotten really self-indulgent, bloated, and toothless.
Crumbles to the ground, though we refuse to see.
And so then punk bands like Sex Pistols, Ramones, and so forth came along and said, fuck all that, we're gonna be deliberately raw, nasty, and unpolished. Which they certainly were compared to, say, the Grease soundtrack or Hall & Oates or whatever else was popular at the time. But if you listen to most of that early punk, it's actually pretty accessible stuff. Like, it's certainly not Discharge or anything like that. As maybe the most obvious example, the Ramones were basically a stripped-down, sped-up version of the Beach Boys. And after that initial wave of punk, the next big thing was hardcore. Black Flag, Minor Threat, GBH, and so forth. And hardcore, as it would be implied from the name, was more aggressive, nastier, faster, more abrasive, and there was definitely nothing pop about that stuff. Because the whole point of it was to deliberately push the limits of punk into something that was less accessible. But in parallel to what was going on with hardcore, taking things in that direction, there was another smaller wave of bands going in the opposite direction. The most notable of those being the Descendants, who came out of the same South Bay hardcore scene as Black Flag and the Circle Jerks, but chose to play these fun, upbeat songs that were more like Jan and Dean than, say, The Exploited. And if I had to point to one band as being really the template for what we think of as pop punk, it would be them. In particular, the Descendants' 1985 album, I Don't Want to Grow Up, which is very clearly the template for early Blink-182. And shortly after the Descendants' original singer, Milo Ackerman, left the band, they got a new singer, changed the name to All, and went even more pop to the point where some of the stuff sounds like it could just be like a late 80s radio rock song. And a few years after that, there was a small scene of what I would call the Ramones core bands, because they were very obviously inspired by the Ramones, most notably Screeching Weasel. But there was also the Vindictives, Sloppy Seconds, and also I have to give a particular shout out to the Queers, who have my personal favorite song in this whole genre. But here's the point I want to make about this sort of early wave of pop punk. Even though this stuff was obviously trying to be more accessible, melodic, and catchy than, say, MDC or the Circle Jerks, there was never any question that this stuff was punk, and at least as far as I recall, nobody ever attacked the credibility of these bands. Like, you would see Descendants, Sloppy Seconds, and Screeching Weasel stickers on someone's skateboard or guitar next to, like, Black Flag, Slayer, and TSOL or something. You'd see their merch at just about every show, and I really can't recall anybody ever saying a negative thing about any of those bands. And I think the reason for that was pretty simple. Even though their music obviously wasn't as aggressive or intense as hardcore, these bands were very clearly 100% part of the punk scene. They only played with punk bands at punk venues and put out their music on punk labels. So the fact that their music was more accessible really wasn't any kind of blow to their credibility. And if you're wondering what changed and sort of made pop punk to be the hated genre that it is, the answer to that is very simple. It was in 1994 when Green Day blew up with Dookie. Because that album and their very televised Woodstock 94 performance officially took the genre mainstream. Nirvana kind of started the process by making alternative music cool, but Green Day and the Offspring completed it, in particular with pop punk. Now, all of a sudden, there were millions and millions of kids all over the world discovering this genre called pop punk. But now the big difference was that unlike the people going to, say, Screeching Weasel or Descendants shows a few years earlier, these people were not part of the punk scene. And I can very distinctly remember this happening. There were a couple kids at my school in 1994 who transformed from being grunge kids that emulated Kurt Cobain last week to basically overnight turning into these punk rock skater kids once Green Day and the Offspring were all over MTV.
Here they are, Green Day.
And personally, I didn't care at all about that. If anything, I thought it was cool. The fact that they were interested in punk now, I thought was awesome. And I certainly had no desire to push them away or anything like that, because I always wished that I had more friends who were into punk. And also, it was pretty cool that now there were cute girls at my school who liked NOFX and Face to Face. But most people, I think, did not feel the same way that I did. And so this was really the turning point for the genre. This is when all the quote-unquote real punks started hating on pop punk. With the important detail that they hated it not because of the way it sounded, but because it brought in this whole new fan base that were, for lack of a better word, outsiders to punk. And so all of a sudden, pop punk was basically no longer considered part of the punk scene like it was just a few years earlier. Even bands like Green Day and NOFX, who had basically unquestionable credentials as part of the DIY punk scene, were now hated and scorned as basically shit for posers who shop for wallet chains at the mall. Which, to be fair, is kind of true. That was a big part of their fan base. But all of this got even more exaggerated a few years later when Blink-182 blew up on the back of All the Small Things, becoming a legitimate mainstream hit song. And you saw things that would have been just absolutely unthinkable even a few years earlier, with, to me, the ultimate example of this being Blink-182 hosting MTV's Spring Break special surrounded by jocks and girls in bikinis.
Hello there, welcome to MTV's favorite spring break performances. We're surrounded by boobies and in sunny San Diego, California.
And after Blink blew up, it was sort of a snowball effect from there. That's where the rest of what I call the TRL pop punk bands had a kind of similar arc, where we saw all these punk bands doing things that normally we would only expect to see from pop stars. For example, Newfound Glory on Cribs.
So, I guess this is going to be the end of it. You've seen our house.
Or maybe the weirdest thing of all was when Simple Plan was the central plot element in a movie starring the Olsen twins. And there's tons more examples of this. I'm pretty sure that there's a picture floating around somewhere of Tony from Mest partying with Kim Kardashian, but I couldn't find it. But I think you get the idea. The point is that this was clearly a very different thing than the pop punk of, say, the 90s, which was kind of like DIY punk that just sort of happened to get mainstream popular. This was kind of the opposite. This was mainstream celebrity culture that just sort of loosely sounded like punk. And this was probably also when the hate for pop punk was at its all-time peak. So let's talk about that a bit and dig beyond the obvious because I think there's some pretty interesting things to explore here. One of the most common criticisms of pop punk that you'll hear is that it takes no talent to write or play this stuff.
With boring riffs that take little talent to play. Sounds like you wrote the song in under a day.
And just to be clear, the guy who made that clip that I just played is a very good friend of mine who I talk to all the time, so there's definitely no shade intended here. But I think what he's saying is kind of reflective of something you hear a lot, so let's unpack it. First of all, yes, it's true. It is very easy to play pop punk from like a technical perspective. Like your average 9th grader could probably play any Green Day song just fine, right? But let's talk about why that is the case. I think a big part of that is because it is, after all, a subgenre of punk. And like I said earlier, the entire point of punk was to be a reaction to the sort of overwrought, self-indulgent music of the 70s that was collapsing under its own weight. And so with punk, the songs were almost comically simple by design, specifically because they wanted it to be such an extreme contrast to these like big, baroque, overproduced songs in the mainstream. So to the original punk bands, if someone came along and turned up their nose and they were like, punk, anybody can play that stuff, they would say, yeah, exactly, that's the point. So the whole idea that it's easy to play, I think I would consider that a feature, not a bug. But there's something even more interesting under the surface of this, which is an unstated assumption that complexity has inherent value in art. Meaning if a song is more difficult to play, or it has more parts, or there's more notes in those parts, then that song is inherently more valuable than something that's simple. They aren't explicitly saying this, but that's the underlying idea when they scoff at punk because it's, quote, easy to play. And from a philosophy of art perspective, to be blunt, I think that's just like a very immature and unsophisticated way to look at art. This kind of criticism of like, oh, that's so easy, anybody could do that. This is something you typically hear from people who honestly just don't really understand art at anything past like the most basic surface level. For example, people who talk shit about modern art say like, oh, my 3rd grade niece could do that, because they have this very shallow perspective that technical difficulty and complexity defines the value of art, and so they aren't able to understand or appreciate the genius of people like, say, Rothko or Duchamp.
Modern art, or conceptual art, isn't art at all. It's one big circle jerk of pretentious twats trying to make themselves look sophisticated by ascribing meaning to something that's completely meaningless.
And beyond that, if you just think about it for a minute, this is just a really dumb idea, and just generally a pretty embarrassing way to think about music. Like the idea that more notes is somehow inherently better. Like if that was true, well, then this would be the best song of all time, right? So I think that criticism is one that's very easy to dismiss. The other common thing you'll hear is something along these lines.
If you like Fall Out Boy and the All-American Rejects, I almost am positive you would like Blink 182 as well. So obviously that means the only people who like them are the stupid fangirls and the gay guys.
Which basically comes down to writing off the entire genre because a lot of teenage girls happen to like it. And I've talked about this many times before, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but personally I think this is just pretty gross. It's a reflection of what I think is a much larger, deeper, bigger problem in what I guess you could call the larger landscape of media criticism, which is honestly a lot of very deep-seated misogyny. Basically, what you'll see is that anything that's popular with young women tends to get almost no respect from critics, whether that is Twilight, Olivia Rodrigo, Simple Plan, or anything else. And why is that? Well, this probably won't be a popular answer, but think about the kind of people who become critics. Whether that is professionals who actually get paid to do it, or just people who make Reddit threads about TV, music, or movies. Who are these people? Typically, I would say these are nerdy men who did not have a lot of success with women in high school. Like the captain of the football team does not become a mod on Rate Your Music and write 3,000-word essays about how Radiohead and Queen are the pinnacle of music, right? So I think it's actually pretty simple. I think these people probably have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder because they feel like women have rejected them throughout their lives, and that manifests itself in a distaste for anything that women happen to like. The other criticism that you'll often hear is something along the lines of this Reddit comment. I also don't think making lame emo crap like the bullshit Fall Out Boy does is very punk rock, now is it? I also don't think making some Avril Lavigne style music or Paramore-like music is all too punk rock either, now is it? If you want real punk, try and listen to Days and Days, Dayglow Abortions, or MDC. That's real punk rock, not that horseshit conventional alt-rock stations play. And just like the other line of criticism about how pop punk is easy to play, this one is also true. Pop punk isn't real punk, at least once it got past that generation of early pop punk bands like Descendants and Screeching Weasel. But to be totally honest, that is exactly why I liked pop punk, specifically because it wasn't real punk. And I just made a whole video about this, so I'm not going to repeat it all here. But to make a long story short, I spent the majority of my teens and early 20s just like completely immersed in basically like the underground DIY punk scene. Like, while all the normal kids at school were going to a football game on Friday night or whatever, in 1995, I was watching Dystopia play in the basement of some like ratty punk rock flophouse. And don't get me wrong, that was really fun and I had a lot of really great experiences. But at the same time, I also realized in hindsight that that scene attracted a lot of like really profoundly dysfunctional, troubled people, and it got pretty dark pretty fast. For example, one of my favorite bands in high school called Capitalist Casualties, rest in peace to Spider Mike, they had a song called Drug Culture, which is an extremely accurate depiction of just that. But it wasn't just hardcore bands like Capitalist Casualties. This was also true of some of the quote-unquote real pop-punk bands. For example, a band called 15, who are part of the same kind of lookout record scene as Green Day, who literally have a song teaching you how to shoot up.
2. Suck water up to the top of the needle. And squirt it out. Suck water up to the top of the needle. And squirt it out.
And all that stuff was unfortunately very relatable to me, since I have, I think, 4 family members who went to prison for drugs. My mom's best friend died of alcohol-related liver failure when I was a little kid. My stepsister died of an OD. My mom was an alcoholic. And my dad used to be a junkie, and I remember him telling me about like shooting up in his neck because all the veins in his hands and arms had collapsed. And I could go on and on about all that kind of depressing, dark shit that had been around, because there's even more than that. But the point is that I had been kind of like surrounded by this kind of like drug addict shit basically my entire life. And the last thing I wanted in my life was more of it. Like, I hated it. So like anything that reminded me of my junkie criminal family members or my parents' addict friends was kind of revolting to me. And so when I found bands like Blink-182 or Newfound Glory, who wrote songs about farting on your friends and like having a crush on the girl at the Orange Julius stand at the mall, but she doesn't like you back, that was just like instantly appealing to me because it was such a breath of fresh air. I didn't want pop punk to be real punk, because real punk usually reminded me of like a very dark, depressing, sad part of life that I wanted to get away from. Which kind of brings up another one of the common criticisms, which is something along these lines.
Tell me again about suburban life and how you cut yourself with the kitchen knife. ISIS kills people just for being queer, but your mom is the real dictator. Hey.
And again, the guy who made this is a good friend of mine, so no shade intended here. But what he's saying is something that you hear a lot about pop punk. Essentially that the music has no substance because the songs are about supposedly trivial things like breaking up with your girlfriend or whatever. And again, let's not stop at the surface level criticism here. Let's look at the unstated assumptions behind it, because I think that's always the interesting angle. And the underlying idea here is that basically art is valid to the extent that it's dark and edgy, or at least reflects some sort of awful trauma that the creator experienced. And like the more trauma the creator experienced, the more valid their art is. And again, to me, that's just like a very unsophisticated, immature way to look at art. This is like the Reddit dudes that think every game should be dark and edgy and full of like graphic, gory violence. Now, of course, there's a place for art that's dark, but if that's the only thing you're looking for in art, which seems to be the case for a lot of the people who hate pop punk, well, I think that's a pretty limiting viewpoint. Because let's take a step back and think about this. Like, humans are very complex creatures. We have a huge range of emotions, from joy to fear to happiness to rage to amusement and everywhere in between. And that's exactly what makes the human experience so interesting, right? So to me, the idea that you would want music to only focus on one fairly narrow range of human emotion, that makes no sense to me. And in that case, I would say perhaps you should challenge yourself to broaden your palette and learn to appreciate things that are outside this very narrow comfort zone you have. And along with that, there's this idea that art is only valid if it's like very dark and angsty, and that the more the artist suffered in the process of making it, the more valid it is. which I have to say I think is one of the absolute biggest problems with the rock fandom these days. And as always, you can count on Noel Gallagher of Oasis to tell it like it is.
Rock music, or whatever you want to call it, it seems to be a lot of shouting about some unspecified injustice that's going on with these. Like Dave Grohl, for instance, what's he on about?
That man knows nothing.
So to sum it all up, if you, for whatever reason, don't like pop punk, that is totally fine. Nobody is obligated to like anything. But I think you'll only get better at not only listening to music, but also at just being a better critical thinker in general, if you ask yourself why you don't like it. And if the honest answer to that question makes you a little bit uncomfortable, well, then maybe it's time to do a little bit of thinking. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. And I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get access to all my videos early. I do Q&As and giveaways sometimes, and there's a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.